I only needed shelter, but this old press already knew my family's name. This is our emblem.
No room, no job, no family left to call. Just a canvas tool roll and $2 she had kept beneath the lining of her mother's field case. And with that money, she bought a forgotten cartographer's printing house outside Salem in Essex County, Massachusetts, a place erased from county maps in 1957. Half the slate roof had slipped inward. Ivy had pried apart the eastern wall. The county condemned it on March 18, 2023, with demolition planned before the first autumn storms. Yet beneath a massive copper plate bolted to the press bed waited a sealed cavity unopened for generations, holding $52,000 and a map that could alter every road ahead. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Eliza Warren had been measuring her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she counted porch boards, window panes, and the seconds between lighthouse flashes across Salem Harbor. Her mother gave her graph paper instead of coloring books. Eliza drew their apartment from above, then the street, placing every drain pipe where it truly stood. Miriam Warren worked in the basement archives of a maritime museum, where salt had entered the old ledgers before anyone thought to stop it. She came home smelling of paste, linen tape, and cold stone, and never unfolded a document without washing her hands. On Saturdays, they took the bus north to Beverly and walked to Miriam's father, Silas Vale, who rented rooms above a shuttered sailmaker's shop. Silas had engraved copper charts before shipyards changed to photographic reproduction. His left thumb was flattened from guiding burins, and he wore a green shade over one eye when he worked. Their ritual never changed. He warmed a copper plate near the radiator, rubbed it with charcoal and oil, then let Eliza trace a coastline through the dark film with a blunt needle. He showed her how a square graver cut differently from a lozenge tool, how pressure widened a channel, and how one careless turn could ruin a harbor entrance. At noon, Miriam brought brown bread and apples, while Silas sharpened the burins on a stone no larger than a matchbox. A map must tell the truth to someone in danger, he said. Eliza learned that accuracy was not neatness, it was a form of shelter. Silas died during a February freeze when Eliza was 16. His landlord cleared the rooms before Miriam finished probate. The rolling press, cedar tool chest, 3 copper plates, and brass divider vanished into an estate auction. Miriam stood in the empty workroom with one gloved hand on the floor and said nothing all the way home. 7 years later, Eliza's own landlord carried silence differently. Graham Pike owned 6 narrow buildings near the commuter rail and visited in polished shoes that never seemed wet. He spoke softly, posted notices at eye level, and replaced doorknobs when tenants asked too many questions. When Eliza's surveying firm folded, she requested 1 week to collect her final pay. Pike listened while looking past her shoulder into the room. On November 6, 2023, Eliza returned from a job interview to find a new brass lock on her door. Her mother's leather field case sat on the landing, opened and emptied. Through the window, she saw Pike beside her boxed belongings. Miriam's antique tripod, plane table, and compass had been placed beside a man in a gray delivery coat. You had your notice. Nothing inside belongs here. Eliza lifted the field case. The lining had been slit, but 2 folded dollar bills remained beneath a loose corner. Miriam had once trusted Pike to store the surveying pieces during a plumbing repair. He had recorded them as abandoned property on a typed inventory. Her signature stood at the bottom, faint from the illness that killed her. The van doors closed without hurry. For 6 weeks, Eliza slept wherever walls could be borrowed. 2 nights passed upright at South Station beneath a departure board clicking through cities she could not afford. In Lynn, she hid behind stacked lobster traps until the tide wind drove her inland. She spent 4 nights in a Peabody church basement, then 3 beneath a Salem parking garage stairwell. Her money fell from $43 to $28 after bus fares, then to $12 after socks, soup, and a laundromat dryer. She learned which library opened earliest, which cafe discarded bread after 7, and which restroom had a hand dryer warm enough to loosen her fingers. By mid-December, the field case held one clean shirt, the tool roll, Miriam's notebook, and $2 she refused to spend. At the Salem Public Library, heat rose through an iron grate beside the local history shelves. Eliza sat there each afternoon reading employment boards and county notices. One Thursday, a classified advertisement had been pinned beneath a flyer for piano lessons. Municipal disposal, abandoned stone printing house, Essex County, quit claim transfer, $2, buyer assumes all liability. A grainy photograph showed broken windows beneath ivy and the dark rectangle of a hanging sign. She copied the parcel number into Miriam's notebook and found the old survey sheet on microfilm. The building stood beyond Salem's northern edge, near a disused tidal road once traveled by chart printers and chandlers. Demolition would begin when the ground allowed. Eliza closed the film drawer, placed both dollars between the notebook pages, and walked to the county office before she could measure every reason not to go. By dusk, she was following a deed toward a building whose last map had deliberately left something out. The northbound bus carried Eliza through Salem before sunrise, its windows clouded by the breath of 6 passengers who did not speak. She rode as far as the driver would accept her last transfer, then stepped down beside North Street with Miriam's field case against her hip and the canvas tool roll tied across her shoulder. The county map showed 11 miles remaining, though the road shoulders narrowed after Danvers and forced her onto frozen grass whenever trucks passed. She walked until the light failed, crossed a stone wall, and slept beneath loose hay in an open-sided barn. The temperature fell to 19 degrees. Each time the wind lifted the roofing tin, the whole structure gave a low iron groan. By morning, frost had silvered the hay around her face. She followed Route 35 into Danvers, where the town was opening one door at a time. The lamps came on at Endicott Diner. A delivery man rolled flour into Bellamy Bakery, and a woman in a blue coat swept salt across the steps of Maple and Main Pharmacy. Crowley Hardware displayed snow shovels beneath a striped awning. Across the intersection, North Shore Shoe Repair had hung a handwritten, closed sign behind a row of work boots. Eliza stopped only long enough to fill her bottle in the library restroom. By 9, she had walked back south toward Salem and entered the Essex County Clerk's Annex, a brick building whose radiators ticked beneath high windows. A security guard looked at the field case, then at her damp shoes, but pointed her toward the property counter without comment. The clerk sat behind a pane of scratched glass. She was a narrow woman with a white streak running through the center of her dark hair, as exact as a survey line. The brass nameplate before her read, Mrs. Helen Brackett. Eliza slid the advertisement parcel number and 2 bills through the opening. Mrs. Brackett did not touch the money. You understand the building has been condemned. Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no certified water service. Yes, ma'am. You understand the county accepts no responsibility for injury. Yes, ma'am. You understand demolition costs become yours if you fail. Eliza looked at the $2 lying between them. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Brackett held her gaze for several seconds, then unlocked a drawer and removed a deed packet bound with red cotton tape. The transfer was not a sale in the ordinary sense. It was a quit-claim disposal intended to move a dangerous parcel off the county ledger. Eliza initialed 7 places, signed twice, and pressed her thumb against the paper to steady her hand while the ink dried. The clerk set a brass seal beneath the final page and pulled its long handle. The stamp came down with a deliberate mechanical bite. There, she said, parcel 14C. She placed the $2 in a shallow wooden drawer rather than the cash box. To reach it, take North Street past the old rope walk marker. Turn right on Dearborn Street, continue until the pavement ends, then follow the tidal lane beyond the rusted gate. The printing house is 3/4 of a mile down, on the left above the marsh. Mrs. Brackett gathered the duplicate pages but paused at Eliza's signature. Warren, she said. Eliza waited. Your mother was Miriam Warren? The room seemed to contract around the ticking radiator. Yes. Mrs. Brackett removed her glasses. A pale groove remained across the bridge of her nose. My father took evening lessons from Silas Vale. Copperplate lettering. This would have been in the 70s. She opened a lower drawer and searched beneath property cards until she found a black and white photograph with softened corners. 3 men stood beside an iron cylinder press. One was Silas, younger and broad-shouldered, his flattened thumb resting against the press wheel. Eliza did not reach for the photograph until Mrs. Brackett pushed it beneath the glass. "He worked there?" Eliza asked. "Not in the house you bought. At least I do not believe so." But he knew the place. Mrs. Brackett tapped the image. He called it the Vale and Wren shop, though the old records name an Abel Wren as the final owner. Your grandfather once told my father that certain charts were printed there after the trade officially closed. What kind of charts? He would not say. Mrs. Brackett studied the condemned property notice as though it had changed while lying on her desk. The surname may be coincidence. Warren and Wren are not the same name. "No," Eliza said, "they are not." But Miriam had sometimes signed restoration notes with a tiny bird drawn inside the final letter of her name. Eliza had believed it was merely an archivist's private mark. Mrs. Brackett returned the photograph to its drawer and slid a heavy iron key through the opening. Its bow had been shaped into a simple compass rose. My father kept that after the county inspection in 1988. No one remembered which lock it served. She closed Eliza's fingers around it. Take it anyway. Outside, a thin sun had begun loosening the ice along the gutters. Eliza followed North Street with the deed inside her shirt. At Dearborn Street, she passed a white farmhouse where an old man in a red wool cap was splitting kindling beside a sagging fence. A brown hound watched her from the porch, lifted its head once, and gave a single uncertain bark. "You bound for Wren's place?" the man called. Eliza stopped. "I believe so." He leaned on the handle of his axe and looked toward the marsh. "Dog won't go near it after dark." The hound lowered its head between its paws as though embarrassed by the disclosure. Beyond the rusted gate, the lane became two frozen ruts. Black walnut trees stood on either side, their limbs holding the shapes of abandoned nests. The ground descended toward saltgrass and a narrow tidal creek where gray water moved beneath plates of ice. The printing house appeared gradually behind the trees. It was built of rough local stone, 36 feet long and perhaps 22 feet wide, with 2 floors beneath a steep slate roof. Several courses along the eastern wall had opened enough to admit ivy roots. The chimney rose square and heavy from the western gable, capped by a broken clay pot. 4 front windows were boarded, 2 upper windows had lost their glass, and a weathered oak sign hung from one chain above the entrance. Only 3 letters remained visible beneath the lichen. W-R-N. The iron key did not fit the front lock. Eliza set down the field case and examined the door frame. The latch had been replaced more recently than the hinges, but the lower panel had swollen and pulled away from its style. She pressed one shoulder against it. Nothing moved. On the third attempt, the wood gave with a crack of old paint and the door opened 4 inches across the stone floor. Cold air came out carrying the smell of wet plaster, mouse nesting, and something darker beneath both, linseed oil. She slipped inside. The front room had once received customers. A counter ran beneath the windows, its surface furred with dust except where rain had fallen through the broken panes and drawn clean black circles. The floorboards bent but held. When her boot crossed the center seam, a loose nail gave a bright metallic complaint. Behind the counter, shelves rose to the ceiling. One still held paper wrappers printed with measurements in a faded hand. Eliza rubbed a corner between her fingers. The paper broke softly, leaving the dry taste of dust at the back of her throat. A narrow doorway opened into the press room. The machine occupied nearly half of it. Its iron frame stood waist-high, anchored to the floor with square bolts. A rolling cylinder rested above a flat press bed stained green where copper had oxidized against it. The handwheel was taller than Eliza's shoulder. When she touched the rim, cold traveled through her glove and into the bones of her wrist. Above the press hung a leather apron, hardened into folds. She moved carefully through the remaining rooms. The rear workshop contained a long engraving bench beneath northern windows, 3 shallow drawers, and a stone sink fed by a pipe that produced no water. In the corner, a stair climbed toward 2 low rooms beneath the roof. Wind entered through the missing glass and passed along the rafters with a hollow whistle. At the back door, Eliza found a hand pump outside and worked its handle until rust-colored water coughed from the spout. She smelled it, touched one drop to her tongue, and spat it into the weeds. The iron taste remained. By dusk, she had covered one broken window with a sheet of oilcloth from the field case and swept a place beside the press. The broom she found had only half its bristles, but it uncovered a rectangle of pine floor broad enough for her body. She ate the final heel of bread from her coat pocket. The building settled around her as darkness came. A slate clicked on the roof. Water moved under the marsh ice. Somewhere inside the eastern wall, a mouse worried at dry plaster. Eliza folded her coat beneath her head and placed the compass rose key inside one glove so it would not vanish during the night. From the floor, the iron press appeared larger than it had by daylight. Its cylinder caught the stripes of moonlight, while the engraved copper plate on the bed remained dull and almost black. She watched it until her eyes closed. The house had been waiting. At first light, Eliza carried the pump handle through 12 stiff strokes before water rose clear enough to fill a chipped enamel basin. The well stood 20 paces behind the printing house, ringed with granite and capped by a warped cedar cover. She boiled every cup she drank. The outhouse leaned toward the marsh, its door held shut by a leather strap, and she learned to step over the third board because a rusted nail had worked upward through it. By the end of the third day, she knew the building through sound. The front room answered a heel with 2 hollow knocks. The stair groaned only along its outer edge. A plank beside the engraving bench gave a soft whistle when pressed, forcing air through a split below. At night, she could tell wind from animals and animals from the slow contraction of old timber. She also knew she could not survive there without fire. Crowley hardware smelled of lamp oil, cut rope, and the dry iron scent of nails stored in open bins. Its owner stood behind the counter with a yellow carpenter's pencil tucked through the silver ring in his left ear. His name was Amos Crowley, and he listened without interrupting while Eliza explained that she had $2 less than nothing and a condemned chimney she needed to make safe. "You bought Wren's press house," he said. "Yes, for $2. Yes." Amos drew the pencil from his ear and rolled it beneath his palm. "I can open a 30-day account, not charity, credit. I do not have work yet. You have a building that will kill you if you do not work." He wrote her name in a ruled ledger, then placed a stained paperback on the counter. The title read Repairs for the Practical Householder. This one is free because no sensible person would pay for it. Eliza carried home a wire chimney brush for $8.75, 25 feet of jointed fiberglass rod for $6.40, a canvas drop cloth for $3, a steel ash shovel for $2.10, and 2 pounds of furnace cement for $1.85. Amos added a pair of cracked leather gloves without entering them in the ledger. The chimney flue was too narrow to inspect from below, so Eliza climbed onto the western roof before the frost softened. She tied the brush to the first rod, lowered it through the broken clay pot, and added sections one at a time. The first obstruction stopped it 6 feet down. She worked the brush in short turns rather than forcing it. Creosote broke loose in brittle scales, rattling against the flue tiles and falling into the fireplace below. A second blockage yielded only after she reversed the brush and drew it upward through the same section 7 times. Black dust rose from the chimney mouth and settled across her sleeves. After 4 hours, her shoulders trembled. She climbed down, shoveled 2 buckets of soot from the hearth, then went back up. The flue required 6 hours altogether. Near the smoke shelf, she found the remains of a swallow's nest mixed with tarry creosote thick enough to burn like coal. She scraped it loose with a bent iron rod, patched a visible mortar gap with furnace cement, and left the chimney untouched overnight. The following afternoon, she built a test fire no larger than her 2 hands. Paper first, then cedar splinters, then 3 pieces of dry maple Amos had tied to her pack. Smoke lifted into the throat, hesitated, and drew upward. Eliza knelt close enough to feel warmth reach her face. She set a dented saucepan over the grate and cooked oats in boiled well water with half an apple sliced into it. The meal tasted faintly of iron and smoke, but steam rose against the cold room, and for the first time since November, she ate without keeping her coat buttoned. Afterward, she began the workroom inventory. The engraving bench held a leather sandbag gone hard with age, used to cradle copper plates while they were cut. Beneath it stood a foot-powered grinding wheel with a cracked stone and a trough green from old filings. 6 drawers remained in the wall cabinet. One contained curled proofs of coastlines printed in fading blue-black ink. Another held 2-ounce bags, their silk split and their charcoal gone damp. A roller cabinet preserved 3 wool daubers, a bottle marked burnt plate oil, and a wooden straightage divided into nautical miles. On the northern wall hung a pantograph with one brass arm missing. Near the press lay an ink slab of polished limestone, darkened at its center by decades of circular mixing. The largest object was the copper plate fixed to the press bed. It measured nearly 3 feet across and was engraved with the coast from Cape Ann to Boston Harbor. Soundings, shoals, and channel marks covered its surface in precise reversed lines. 4 iron bolts secured its corners. Oxidation had gathered around them in turquoise crusts. Eliza brushed the plate with a dry cloth and noticed that the coastline ended cleanly. But the decorative compass rose near Marblehead had been cut over a second design. Someone had burnished away earlier lines and engraved the rose afterward. She tapped the plate with the wooden handle of the ash shovel. Copper answered with a dense, bright note. At the lower edge, the note changed. She tapped again, moving 1 inch at a time. The sound beneath the compass rose was flatter, as though the press bed did not sit solidly under that section. She pressed both palms against the plate. It shifted no more than a breath, but the opposite edge remained still. Weight alone should have held it evenly. Eliza cleaned the bolt heads with lamp oil. 3 were ordinary square-cut fasteners. The 4th had no slot and no flats, only a cedar disc fitted into a shallow circular recess, stained green to resemble corroded metal. She worked the point of Miriam's smallest divider around its edge. The disc lifted. Beneath it lay the head of a recessed brass screw. Eliza stopped and listened to the house, although nothing had moved beyond the ordinary wind. She borrowed a broad screwdriver from Amos and returned before dusk. The first 3 bolts came free with penetrating oil and steady pressure. The hidden screw resisted until she heated the surrounding copper with a cloth soaked in hot water, then turned it 1 careful quarter at a time. The plate was too heavy to lift outright. She slid the ash shovel blade beneath one corner, raised it enough to insert a block of firewood, then repeated the process at the opposite end. Inch by inch, she elevated the plate until a black opening appeared between copper and iron. A hollow had been cut into the center of the press bed. Inside lay 4 packages wrapped in waxed sailcloth. Eliza sat on the floor before touching them. Her breath had shortened and she waited until it became regular again. Then she carried each bundle to the engraving bench and opened the smallest first. The sailcloth unfolded around 12 burins fitted with pearwood handles, each blade protected by a cork. A rocker used for mezzotint work lay beneath them, beside a scraper, burnisher, and a small roulette wheel for laying dotted texture. Silas had shown her tools like these, but never tools kept so carefully. The second package held 3 copper blanks separated by rag paper. Their surfaces were coated in beeswax and lamp black to prevent oxidation. On the uppermost plate, someone had scratched a single guiding line, then stopped. The third bundle contained a rolled sheet of linen-backed paper and a flat tin box tied with faded blue cord. Eliza did not unroll the paper, not yet. She opened the 4th package instead. Inside were bank envelopes sealed with brittle wax, cloth bags of coins, and a tarnished military medal wrapped in a handkerchief. The medal bore an eagle above the words Spanish War Veteran and the year 1898. She counted the money after dark. The paper currency had been arranged by denomination and bound in packets. The coins took longer. There were Morgan silver dollars, Barber half-dollars, Indian head cents, and $20 St. Gaudens gold pieces wrapped individually in tissue. She recorded every quantity in Miriam's notebook and checked each column twice. The total came to $52,000. She wrote the figure once, then closed the notebook. The tin box remained on the bench beside the linen-backed roll. Its lid had been engraved with a small wren standing inside a compass circle. Beneath the blue cord, an envelope carried one line in brown ink. For the one who opens the press. Eliza touched the writing but did not break the seal. She returned the coins to their cloth bags, covered the tools, and lowered the copper plate onto wooden blocks without fastening it. Then she carried the unopened letter and rolled map to the front room, where the fire had diminished to red seams between gray ash. Sleep did not come. Near midnight, she walked through the back door and crossed the frozen grass to the tidal creek. The sky had cleared. Water moved black beneath the stars, entering channels that disappeared into the marsh and returning by routes no county map would ever show completely. She stood there until the cold reached through both soles of her boots. The house had been waiting. Morning came pale through the oilcloth, turning the frost along its folds into a field of white veins. Eliza placed the tin box beside the hearth and untied the faded cord. The envelope had softened at its corners but remained sealed. When she held it near the window, she recognized the long downward stroke of the letter Y and the small bird worked into the final name. It was Miriam's hand, copied from an older original. Eliza broke the wax. "My dear one, whoever you are, if you are reading this, then the great plate has been raised and the press has chosen another pair of hands. Dr. Samuel Reed of Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston told me on September 3, 1987, that the weakness in my fingers was amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. He said the illness would take my grip, then my speech, and perhaps leave me less time than I had been counting on. I came home by train and sharpened every burin in the chest. The shop began with Abel Wren, born in Marblehead in 1781, who pressed harbor charts here after 1809. His daughter Mercy Wren, born in 1832, carried coated coastal routes north during the years before the Civil War. Mercy's daughter, Ruth Vale, kept the press through the winter of 1864, while her husband Josiah died with the 54th Massachusetts Infantry after wounds received at Olustee. Ruth's son, Elias Vale, reopened the trade in 1889. Elias taught my father, Silas Vale, who taught me. Miriam Warren and I tried to teach my daughter before illness and debt scattered what remained. The trade closed on October 14, 1956. After that came more than 30 years of silence, though the press was never abandoned by those who understood why certain lines had been cut. The rolled sheet beside this letter is Mercy's original chart. Its unmarked coves, creek mouths, and safe houses guided men, women, and children away from slave catchers moving through the ports. Never polish it, never frame it in direct sun, keep it beneath linen at 40 to 50% humidity. For copper work, warm the plate only to about 90 degrees Fahrenheit before spreading ink. Mix 2 parts burnt plate oil with 1 part bone black, then adjust by touch. Wipe first with tarlatan, then the heel of the hand. Soak rag paper for 20 minutes and blot it until the shine leaves. Turn the press wheel slowly. 1 passage is enough if the pressure is true. The money was gathered from work, not speculation. Some came from charts, some from repairs, some from payments hidden by people who could not safely name what they had received. Use it to keep the roof, fire, tools, and trade alive. Inheritance is not possession. It is work left unfinished by hands that trusted another hand would come. If you know our family, forgive what was lost. If you do not, then blood is not the condition, care is the house is not empty, it has been waiting. You are welcome here. Miriam Vale, Warren, December 21, 1987. Eliza read the letter twice. The second time, she held the lower edge against the table so the paper would not tremble. Then she folded it along its original creases, each one already whitened by Miriam's hands, and returned it to the envelope without pressing the seal closed. On the final page, beneath the signature, Miriam had added a penciled instruction. Behind the shop, where the creek divides, look for the granite marker cut with a north arrow. Eliza carried the letter through the back door. Snow had gathered in the hollows of the marsh grass. She followed the creek downstream until it divided around a low island of reeds. There, half buried beneath blackberry canes, stood a granite post no higher than her knee. Its upper face bore a shallow north arrow and the same wren inside a compass circle that marked the tin box. She cleared the moss with her glove. From that point, the creek aligned with 3 places on Mercy's chart: a concealed landing near Marblehead, a widow's house north of Gloucester, and a sheltered cove beyond Newburyport. The routes were not drawn as roads. They were engraved as depth marks and harmless shoreline corrections readable only by someone taught how to compare the false soundings. Eliza knelt beside the marker until the wet cold entered her trousers. When she returned, she chose one object from the heirloom bundle, a small brass navigator's lamp with a cracked horn pane. She trimmed its cotton wick, filled the reservoir with the last of the lamp oil, and struck a match. The flame rose unevenly, steadied, and cast the compass-shaped vent holes across the wall. In that light, she remembered people whose names might otherwise have vanished into the difficult weeks behind her. Mrs. Brackett had kept Silas's key instead of discarding it. Amos Crowley had opened a ledger for a woman with no address. The librarian, Ms. Alvarez, had let Eliza remain beside the heating grate after closing while sleet struck the windows. At Endicott Diner, a waitress named Doris had wrapped 2 biscuits in wax paper and said they had been counted wrong. None of them had changed her life alone. Each had moved one small obstruction from the road. Before the story goes further, think of one small kindness someone once gave you when they had no reason to help. Perhaps it was a meal, a ride, a warm room, or a patient word. Tell us about it in the comments and keep that person's name from disappearing. That night, Eliza placed the Burins in their leather roll beside her blanket. The tin box rested near her shoulder, the map beneath the engraving bench, and Miriam's letter inside the field case. The brass lamp burned until the room was warm enough for sleep. The first snow came on December 2nd and left 6 inches along the tidal lane, enough to soften the outlines of the broken slate but not enough to hide where rain had entered. Eliza read the roofing chapter in Amos's manual 3 times beside the hearth. The roof measured 38 feet by 24 on each slope, once the overhang was included. She calculated 18 squares of coverage, 20 rolls of felt, and 32 pounds of cut nails, then reduced the order by salvaging every sound slate she could lift without splitting. Amos studied her figures, crossed out one line, and brought a short roofing hatchet from beneath the counter. My brother carried this 30 years. The pole was scarred, and the blade had been sharpened into a narrow crescent. I cannot take it. You can return it to the family by using it. A retired roofer named Wren Vale appeared the following morning in a canvas coat buttoned to his chin. He had one cloudy eye and climbed the ladder without waiting to be asked. When Eliza mentioned payment, he shook his head. Keep the weather outside, that will do. They worked for 11 days. Vernon showed her how to sister, a split rafter with straight spruce, clamping the new timber against the old before driving staggered nails. They snapped chalk lines across the felt so each course rose evenly. His roofing rhythm used 3 strokes, one to set the nail, one to drive it near flush, and one light turn of the hatchet face to seat it without bruising the slate. On the 4th morning, he pointed with 2 fingers. That nail's proud. Eliza looked at the head, catching pale light. Pull it. She drew it, reset the slate, and tried again. By mid-December, the last ridge piece lay bedded in lime mortar. Snowmelt ran from the eaves instead of through the ceiling. Vernon climbed down, folded the ladder, and stood listening while the wind crossed the finished roof. No drip, he said. Inside, Eliza placed a basin beneath the old stain out of habit. It remained empty all night. Cold found the chimney next. The exterior bricks had begun spalling, their fired faces loosening in thin red flakes. Between them, the old mortar powdered under Eliza's fingernail. She removed only what had failed, brushing each joint clean before packing it with a mix of 2 parts hydraulic lime to 1 part fire clay, where heat reached the inner courses. For 3 weeks, the temperature stayed in the 20s. She worked from a plank scaffold built by Vernon, covering the fresh joints with damp burlap so the mortar would not dry too quickly. Every 15 minutes, her bare fingers went numb, because gloves made it impossible to press mortar tightly behind the brick edges. She climbed down, warmed both hands around the kettle, then returned before feeling had fully come back. One western corner required rebuilding from the smoke chamber upward. Eliza numbered each salvageable brick in chalk, lowered it by rope, and reset the courses around a plumb line. On the interior, she parged the rough gaps with a thinner lime and fire clay coat, working upward with a rounded trowel until the surface would no longer catch the chimney brush. The test fire came on January 27th. She lit dry pine beneath 2 narrow maple splits and watched the first smoke rise. It entered the throat without rolling into the room. Outside, a clean gray stream lifted above the repaired stack and bent toward the marsh. Eliza held her palm near the chimney breast. No hidden heat gathered behind the plaster. No soot marked the joints. The smoke drew clean. The white pine floors had survived beneath soot, wax, and 80 years of tracked mud. Their hand-cut rosehead nails still held most boards, though several heads stood high enough to tear sandpaper. Eliza set each proud nail with a steel punch before renting a random orbit sander from Amos for $14 a day. She began with 80 grit, moving in slow overlapping passes with the grain. The first pass removed the gray surface and exposed scars from press cards, drop type, and boot heels. The second pass at 120 grit quieted the ridges without erasing them. She used 220 only after filling 2 narrow splits with pine slivers plain to fit. Around the press and along the walls, she sanded by hand because the machine could not reach without striking iron or stone. Dust entered everything. It gathered in her hair, whitened the hearth, and lay inside her boots despite the rags tied over the tops. She swept between grits, wiped the boards with a barely damp cloth, and waited for the grain to settle before continuing. 3 oil coats followed. The first disappeared almost at once. The second remained glossy for an hour. The third she rubbed thin with linen until no pools stood around the nail heads. Then she barred the doors and allowed a full 48-hour cure. The color shifted from dark honey toward mahogany, deeper, where the old press wheels had compressed the grain. One morning, she woke before dawn with her arms too heavy to lift the kettle. She walked to the marsh instead of opening the tool chest. A great blue heron stood in the creek shallows, motionless except for the wind moving the feathers along its neck. Eliza watched until it struck once and rose. She did no work that day. The following morning, she returned to the floor with steadier hands. 8 windows remained in this house. 3 had no glass at all. 4 were cracked from corner to corner. 1 pane, wavy and green at the edges, had survived since 1788 according to a date scratched into its sash. Eliza removed that frame first, wrapped the glass in a wool blanket, and stored it flat beneath the engraving bench. For the broken openings, Amos found salvaged panes close enough in thickness to the originals. Eliza cleaned each rabbet with a putty knife, brushed on linseed oil, and pressed a narrow bed of DAP 33 glazing putty into the wood before setting the glass. She drove the points lightly, then rolled the putty between both palms into long cords. The bevel had to meet the sightline cleanly. Too steep and it showed from inside. Too shallow and rain would sit against the glass. She drew the knife in one unbroken motion whenever she could, wiping the blade on burlap between passes. Several sash cords had rotted inside the weight pockets. She replaced them with a 1/4-inch cotton cord, feeding each length over the pulley and tying a figure-8 knot through the counterweight eye so it could not pull free under load. The first repaired sash dropped crooked. Eliza opened the pocket again and found one weight hanging 2 inches lower than the other. She shortened the cord, reset the knot, and tested the sash until it stayed wherever her hand released it. On the final window, she lifted the preserved 1788 pane back into its frame. The old glass bent the marsh beyond it into soft vertical currents. As she smoothed the last putty line, a chickadee landed on a black walnut branch outside. Its feet closed around the thin wood and its head turned once toward the room. Eliza lowered the knife and waited until it flew. The walls revealed their age only after the windows stopped rattling. Behind the cracked finish coat lay horsehair plaster pressed against hand-split oak lath, each strip uneven and fastened with square nails. Eliza's first patch beside the chimney fell before supper. The second cracked overnight. The third remained until she touched it with the trowel, then slid down the wall in one heavy sheet. Amos brought an old feed bag from the loft above his store. A braid of clean horsehair had rested inside since his father repaired their kitchen ceiling. Cut it short and tease it apart. Eliza mixed the lime plaster slowly, turning the hair through it until no clumps remained. She pressed a scored scratch coat between the laths, waited until it held beneath her thumb, then added a 3/8-inch brown coat. That layer cured beneath damp cloth for 72 hours. The finish coat was 1/8 inch, smooth but not polished. She feathered its edges into the old wall until the repairs remained visible only as pale islands around the chimney. These patches will hold another 100 years. The words stayed inside her. She washed the trowel and set it beside the hearth. Doris from Endicott Diner began leaving paper bags on the doorstep each Tuesday. Eliza always recognized her work by the blue thread tied around the folded top. Inside might be 2 biscuits, a heel of meatloaf, or an apple pie with one side collapsed. Doris had flour in the lines of her knuckles and refused every coin Eliza offered. "You can pay me in candles when the shop reopens." No promise had been made that the shop would reopen, but Doris spoke as if she had seen the sign already hanging. In March, a boy named Caleb arrived on a red Schwinn with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, tall enough that his coat sleeves ended above his wrists, and he had one front tooth chipped into a clean white angle. He split the storm-fallen walnut behind the outhouse into stove lengths, working without conversation until Eliza carried water outside. "I can pay for the afternoon." He shook his head and set another round upright, my mother said, "about your grandfather. That was all." He swung again and the wood opened along its own grain. Reverend Boyd passed the gate each morning on his walk from the parsonage to the harbor. He wore a black felt hat with a rain-darkened brim and never entered unless invited. At the gate, he tipped 2 fingers toward the house. "Keep these hands steady." It was always the same 4 words. Eliza began waiting to hear them. She postponed the cellar until February 11th. The door beneath the stairs had swollen shut, and when it opened, cold air came up smelling of stone, clay, and rusted iron. 7 granite steps descended to a fieldstone floor measuring 12 feet by 15. At the center lay a dressed-to-granite slab, too regular to be part of the foundation. Its surface carried the craft mark of a wren enclosed by a compass rose. Eliza swept around it but did not lift it. Under the 3rd stair, her fingers found a small oak box wedged behind a loose stone. The lid had no latch. Inside rested a brass key whose bow curved like the arms of a cartographer's compass. Beneath it was a tintype dated 1903. A young woman stood outside the printing house before the ivy reached the windows. She held an engraving burin against her apron. Her chin, wide-set eyes, and uneven left eyebrow were Eliza's own, carried backward through time. The inscription read, "Clara Vale, daughter of Elias Vale, age 25, summer of 1903. Eliza carried the tintype upstairs and placed it beside Miriam's letter. The brass key remained on the mantel beneath the navigator's lamp. She did not know what had opened. Snow withdrew from the south wall first, exposing nettles, broken slate, and the foundations of an old rain barrel. The creek grew loud with runoff. Walnut catkins hung from the branches like green-brown cords, and small birds carried grass into the abandoned nests Eliza had watched on her first walk down the lane. She cleaned the recovered burins, but did not begin a full chart that spring. The old copper demanded more skill than memory could provide, and Mercy's map was not a surface on which to practice. Eliza chose one worn Indian head cent from the cache. She would spend its equivalent on lampblack, plate oil, paper, and a small copper sample. The coin itself remained in its cloth bag. Each evening she cut straight lines, cross-hatching, and shallow curves into scraps no larger than her palm. Some printed too dark, others printed hardly at all. She kept every proof and dated the corner. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Eliza finished her first complete chart. It showed the tidal creek behind the printing house from the Walnut Ridge to its meeting with Salem Sound. She had measured the water at 6 stages of tide, marked the mudflats, and engraved the saltgrass islands with lines fine enough to disappear beneath excess ink. The copper plate warmed beside the stove to 90 degrees. She worked burnt plate oil and bone black across it, wiped with tarlatan, then finished with the heel of her hand until the high surface shone. The damp rag paper passed beneath the rolling cylinder once. When she lifted it, every channel stood in reverse no longer. The creek moved across the page in exact black lines, patient and usable. She placed the first proof beneath Miriam's letter. The restored interior had not become new. That mattered to Eliza. The white pine floor retained its press wheel scars. Pale plaster patches surrounded the chimney. The 1788 glass still bent the marsh into watery shapes, while the iron press carried green oxidation in the corners she had chosen not to polish. The engraving bench stood beneath the northern windows. Burins rested in Silas's leather roll. Mercy's chart remained sealed beneath linen in a cabinet Eliza built from dry walnut. The brass key waited on this mantel until an April storm split the oldest walnut tree near the tidal lane. The trunk did not fall, but a long section of bark tore free from its western side. Beneath it, level with Eliza's shoulder, a circular brass plate had been fixed into the wood and allowed to disappear as the tree grew around its edges. The plate bore the compass mark. Eliza brought the key outside. It entered the narrow slot without resistance. Behind the plate was a cavity lined with lead and sealed against water by beeswax. Inside lay a folded 48-star American flag, its cotton faded but dry. Beneath it rested a note wrapped around a sprig of cedar. The writing belonged to Ruth Vale, August 19, 1864, my son. Word came from Florida that your father, Josiah, has died of the wounds he received at Olustee. I have folded his small flag here because the press must continue, and grief cannot be allowed to mark the routes poorly. Mercy has brought 3 travelers north this week. One was a mother carrying a child too tired to cry. We printed the harbor sheet before dawn and changed 2 soundings so the captain would know which inlet remained unwatched. When you are old enough to take the wheel, remember that a straight line is not always the safest line. Measure for the frightened person, not the comfortable one. Your mother, Ruth Vale. The 48-star flag had been added later, perhaps when the cavity was reopened after 1912. Its folds protected Ruth's smaller wartime banner inside a hand-sewn field of stars no larger than a handkerchief. Eliza returned both flags to archival tissue. She left the cavity empty and carried the brass plate indoors, unwilling to ask the damaged walnut to guard anything more. The Spanish war medal from the press bed bore no name, but county military rolls connected it to Elias Vale's younger brother Thomas, who had served with the 8th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry in 1898. On July 1, 2025, the anniversary of the Battle of San Juan Hill, Eliza walked to Greenlawn Cemetery in Salem. Mrs. Brackett had located Thomas's grave beneath a leaning cedar where the surname had nearly worn away. Eliza cleaned the stone with water and a soft brush. She laid the medal there for 1 hour, then returned it to its handkerchief. No speech was made. The cedar moved above her in the warm wind. Of the money beneath the press, she used the value of 4 coins. 1 paid the final roofing bill. 1 covered the chimney brick. 1 purchased the first copper sheets and rag paper. The 4th repaired the hand pump when its leather cup split. She kept a record for each expenditure, including the dates, receipts, and reason. The remaining currency and coins went back into waxed sailcloth beneath the press bed. On top, she placed a new envelope for the next one. The shop reopened without an advertisement. Doris pinned a cream index card to the corkboard beside the diner register. It read, "Hand-pressed local charts. Repairs to old maps, inquiries by letter." The first request came from a fisherman who wanted the creek as it had appeared before the hurricane of 1938. The second came from a woman tracing a family property erased by highway construction. By autumn, the mailing list held 43 names. Eliza printed slowly. She refused work that required false boundaries, invented age, or decorative coastlines dangerous enough to be mistaken for navigation. Most weeks produced only 3 or 4 acceptable impressions. Caleb returned one Saturday carrying a long object wrapped in a horse blanket. He had grown broad through the shoulders and no longer arrived on the Schwinn. The chipped tooth remained, visible when he smiled. "I made something you did not order." He unwrapped a hand-carved walnut sign. The upper line followed the faint letters found on the original oak board. Wren and Vale cartographers. Them, on a separate strip of walnut, Caleb had carved, and daughter Eliza ran her thumb through the final letters. The carving was not perfectly even, the word tilted upward by half an inch. "It should," Caleb said, "the building does." They mounted it above the front door using the original iron bracket. Doris stood in the lane with her apron beneath her coat. Amos brought a level but did not insist they use it. Reverend Boyd removed his hat. No ceremony followed. They went inside for coffee. That winter, Eliza selected a sheet of linen paper and placed it on the engraving bench. She sharpened a pencil with Silas's small knife, then opened Miriam's letter beside her own blank page. She began with the same words. "My dear one, whoever you are." She wrote that the roof had held through 2 winters. She explained where the well pipe froze, which stair complained in damp weather, and how the press wheel needed 1 drop of oil at the lower bearing every 7th working day. She recorded the location of Mercy's chart, Ruth's note, Clara's tintype, and Thomas's medal. She described how to warm copper, mix ink, judge paper by its surface, and stop before a line became too deep. Then she wrote that no person who found the house owed it a life. They could remain, repair it, practice the trade, or leave after making the place safer for another. An inheritance grounded in work could not be preserved by turning it into a prison. She signed only her name and left the date blank. Outside, winter water moved beneath a skin of ice. The walnut tree held its broken side toward the marsh, alive around the wound. Above the doorway, the new sign made a low wooden sound whenever the wind changed direction. The house had been waiting. Eliza folded her unfinished letter and placed it in the tin box, leaving enough empty space for another hand to add its own pages. At dusk, she locked the shop, then stood on the tidal lane while light faded from the restored windows. Smoke rose cleanly from the chimney. Behind the old glass, the iron press remained visible, dark and exact. A cartographer's printing house waits. It has always waited. In the county clerk's annex, Mrs. Brackett kept one of Eliza's $2 bills in the shallow drawer beneath her property cards. The second had entered the county cash box, but this one lay flat beneath the photograph of Silas beside the press. She never spent it.